Dr. David Mantik is a board-certified radiation oncologist who has visited the National Archives on 9 separate occasions. He has written extensively on JFK medical evidence, and particularly the autopsy images, and used his extensive medical expertise to show that JFK autopsy x-rays are fraudulent. Let that sink in. He's used his medical expertise to show that the official x-rays on JFK's head were fraudulent. Today, Dr. Mantik will be speaking about JFK's head wound and the Harper fragment. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. David Mantik.
Good morning. Who's awake? 2 or 3 of you? I assume that most of you, maybe all of you, were here last night. So we'll proceed from where we were. This is the Harper fragment photographed in Dallas. And go to the next slide. I want to emphasize that it was photographed by the FBI as well. This is a much higher resolution image, and this is the basis of the conclusions that I was telling you about last night. I didn't emphasize that enough last night. You can see many details on here that were really difficult to see on the earlier image. The earlier image, the one from Dallas, is the reason that Angel was misled and the reason that I was misled about suture lines. There are no suture lines on the Harper fragment as determined by this high resolution photographic image and also by the x-rays. I should say singular, one x-ray. Well, actually there were multiple exposures. The FBI took many, many exposures of that bone fragment. And the one exposure with the lowest amount of x-ray energy used showed the metal clearly. The other ones did not, so it was important that they do that. Let's go down to where we left off last night. Go down, I'm guessing here, maybe 10 slides. Yes, keep going. That's good. Go back to that one. Back one more slide. We covered this last night, but for continuity, I thought I'd repeat this so that you're not lost in the middle of this transition. So in 1977, Dr. Cairns was interviewed by Andy Purdy, and Cairns described where this Harper fragment came from. He viewed it as occipital bone, and he also described the surface. Next slide. So I placed the Harper fragment on the back of the skull. This is a ruler measuring in inches, and the center of the bone is 2.5 inches above the base of the skull, precisely as Cairns described it. The next slide. Here's the center of the Harper fragment as I placed it. This is the external occipital protuberance, and this is the base of the skull. So Cairns' description is uncannily like the one that I arrived at purely by looking at the x-rays and determining where there was a hole in the skull where this bone might fit. Next slide. We saw this one last night. So we'll go to the next one. And we discussed this too. Up in this corner, we saw abdominal fat pads and even a nipple. So what we're doing is looking at JFK from the back of his head. He's lying on his back. His head is turned slightly to the left. The midline dividing the left skull from the right is here. So this is his left side. This is his right side. And we're looking all the way down his body here. His head is not just turned slightly, but I think it's also lifted up so they could photograph this area. So you picture him lying on his back, head slightly turned left, and then head raised so they could photograph that area. Question? You know, the camera is far enough away from the body that the field of view is large enough to see all of that. If somebody wants to demonstrate on the table, we can do it. Any volunteers? You probably can't see now, right? Next slide. You know what? I don't think we see his nose here because the head is tilted up. I think we might be able to see his eyebrow in this area. You see, I had the real advantage of seeing the color images viewed in stereo. Can you see now? Viewed in stereo. That makes an enormous difference. And oddly enough, I don't believe Robert Kirshner or any other government investigator ever used stereo viewing, so they lost a real opportunity. So I had a real advantage over them. Next slide. And we discussed this last night too. The Harper fragment fits in back here. The metallic smear is over here where Humes and Boswell said the bullet entered. Go ahead. Yeah, so JFK probably had his fill of those things. So we were talking mainly about the clues to an occipital origin, so I'm going to give you some more clues to the occipital origin, and I should have put to rest the parietal skull as an origin last night because the smear is in the wrong place. The bullet cannot enter at the top of the head. So here's Boswell's sketch. This was what he did for the ARRB. This is a scalp laceration. So what he's telling us is that bone is missing all through this area. Bone is all gone. Well, his memory was poor because we know from the x-rays that the bone wasn't gone that far. It was only gone close to the vertex of the skull. So we know right away that Boswell's memory isn't perfect. But he does describe bone missing back where the Harper fragment derived, in my view, and the approximate entry site that Humes and Boswell found was about there. Notice also the lambdoid sutures are here and here. And I told you last night that we cannot see the lambdoid sutures above about here. So we know there's a little bone missing around the Harper fragment as well. But the lambdoid sutures are not on the Harper fragment, so it has to come from an area in between them as I've described. Here's the Harper fragment as viewed from the back of the skull. Here's the metallic smear found on the Harper fragment. The EOP is here. And if you were to place the fake 6.5 millimeter object, it would be about there. Of course, it wasn't real. And here is where Humes and Boswell placed, and Fink too, placed the bullet entry wound, just as a reminder. And here again, you see the lambdoid suture. Bone was missing above approximately here. And so everything that I'm telling you is consistent, basically. That's the point. Go back there, one more comment about that. The red spot in the scalp that the HSCA chose for the entry was way up here. And of course they had to do that because if they had retained it at this low level, it would have really damaged, if not destroyed, the cerebellum. And the drawing of the brain, the photographs of the brain, show that the cerebellum is intact, so they were stuck. They really had to move it up. Now, after I did this work, I realized that I had taken so many measurements at the archives, and this is just one page of measurements of many, that I realized I could probably determine just from the measurements I took where the bone was missing at the back of the skull. Because you see, I took lots of measurements way here at the back of the skull. And I said, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of this before? So it turns out that you probably can't read these numbers well, but the lower numbers up here mean more bone, and the higher numbers here mean less bone. So about where this step-off occurs, we start seeing a plateau where the numbers are consistent, they're about the same, and they represent missing bone. That's where the Harper fragment came from, and I said, oh my gosh, this is really additional confirmation that the bone was missing back here. You can't appreciate that with your eye. It was critical that this area be measured, be able to make that conclusion. Go ahead. We're still awake? So Doug Horn was the first to propose 3 headshots. Most critics of the Warren Commission believe, of course, that there was at least 1 shot from the front, and many accept 1 shot from the back. But Horn was the first to trailblaze this route. And let me just briefly describe what some of the problems are. There was a shot from the rear. I think Hims and Boswell were correct. My placement of the Harper fragment serendipitously confirms what they said. Here's another clue. Biological debris was found on the hood, on the ornament on the hood of the limousine. On the ornament on the hood of the limousine. That's the front of the limousine. If there is only a shot from the front and no shot from the rear, how does that get there? That's a long way from JFK's head to the ornament hood on the front of the limousine. So if there's only a frontal shot, how does brain matter get all the way from JFK's head to the front of the limousine with only a frontal shot? Sherry Feaster has made it pretty clear from her research in the literature that backscatter only goes 3 or 4 feet. So backscatter from a frontal shot would only go 3 or 4 feet. That's not enough to deposit debris on the ornament on the front of the hood. So if you want an objective argument that there had to be a shot from the rear, that's it. I believe there was, but we do have other corroborating evidence too. You don't have to take this totally on faith. There was a shot from the rear. Hims and Boswell were right. That metallic smear I keep talking about did represent a shot near the EOP. We're not done with this yet. Now, I think some of you have heard James Jenkins this week. Let's see some hands. A fair number have. And James, of course, is quite insistent that there was evidence for a shot here, near the ear, anterior to the ear, and slightly superior to the center of the ear. And he says that he saw what looked like a bullet hole, a few millimeters across, round, and the borders were gray. He said that Fink saw it too. But in Dealey Plaza that day, there's a long list of witnesses who described the same thing. You can read about it in my ebook. This is certainly not devoid of evidence. There's a lot of evidence for a shot here, entering here. That's the grassy knoll shot, of course. Now what about this one? Same thing here. Well, that's pretty solidly confirmed by the X-rays. You can see metallic debris on the X-rays going all the way up to here, right behind the forehead bone, as Mike Chester has recently observed again at the archives. It's right there. This shot cannot explain metallic debris up here. There's no way. So we're left with 3 shots, not 2 headshots. Next slide. Sherry Feaster takes a different tack, as many of you know. Sherry Feaster says there's only 1 headshot. Current forensic research supports a single gunshot originating in front of the president, and front is not the grassy knoll. All other explanations are myths. My review of Feaster is at Kennedy's and King, in case you want to read it. Next slide. Oh, Pat Spear, by the way, does not believe in any frontal headshots. He believes in only posterior shots. So you see how widely divided we are on this issue. Now, in my ebook, there's a table that summarizes all the objective evidence I could find. In one column, we have the EOP shot, that's the Hims and Boswell site, and I list the reasons for believing in that. The second column is the forehead shot. That's mainly based on the metallic trail of particles. And then we have what I call the oblique shot. This is the James Jenkins shot. And then there's a fourth column for a bullet or bullets that struck the street. There are 3 witnesses in the Warren Commission volumes that describe that type of event, and there are 2 witnesses outside the Warren Commission volumes that describe that. We have a total of 5 witnesses who saw something and heard something strike the street. We've mentioned the debris on the hood ornament as an argument for the posterior shot. We talked about we haven't talked about the Harper fragment ejection in the occipital hole. Let's go back to the previous slide. One more. So we all know that there's a big hole back here. Which shot is the most likely to have produced a big hole in the back of the head? It had to be a frontal shot, but it's not this one. We can see the metallic trail here, and it peters out. The last fragment, and that's the largest one, is about here. It doesn't even seem to exit. It's not able to produce that big hole, which is much lower on the skull. It's also way too high. But the grassy knoll shot entering obliquely here is a perfect match to the big occipital hole. That's the grassy knoll shot. That's the one that produced the large hole at the rear. And even the neurosurgeon, Kemp Clark, said that it was a tangential shot. He should have said an oblique shot, but he wasn't a geometrician, so we'll excuse him for that. But it was an oblique shot. It just barely got into the head and caused the big blowout at the rear. So let's jump ahead a couple of slides. So in conclusion, here's where we are on the Harper fragment then. I list 15 clues in the ebook, so we're not going to do all of those. But let's just summarize what we've talked about, plus a few other items. Number 1, of course, we have the 3 Dallas pathologists, each of whom said this was occipital bone. And they weren't stuck with photographs. They had the real thing in their hands. All 3 of them agreed. And Cairns, especially, as you've seen, gave very specific reasons for believing that. I cited John Ebersol, the radiologist, who saw the x-rays, who saw JFK's head. And he knew there was a big hole at the back of the head. He told me it was a big hole. That was his word. Number 3 were the Parkland witnesses. You've probably all seen the photographs that Robert Groden has collected. That's a very powerful set of images that he has. It's so hard to disbelieve several dozen professionals on something like this. It's such a simple observation. How could they possibly all be wrong? They're not. Number 4, we actually have 8 Bethesda physicians who said there was a big hole in the back of the head as well. That's pretty extraordinary. Michael Kurtz writes about this, and the list is in my ebook. 5, the cerebellum was seen and it was traumatized. It wasn't just seen, it was traumatized severely. McClellan, many of you have watched his online video where he describes watching the cerebellum fall out of JFK's head as he was watching. Very impressive. But we have at least 8 physicians who said the cerebellum was visible and that it was traumatized. Number 6, the autopsy report actually says the occiput was affected. That's hard to believe, but it's there. Even the autopsy report says the occipital area was traumatized. Number 7 was the Boswell sketch, which I've shown you. He's also described this in his own words. Number 8, the metallic smear was on the outside. We covered that last night, and I emphasized how ridiculous it would be to put the Harper fragment at the top of the head, because that would mean that the bullet entered there. Nobody believes that, but they still put it up there. I don't know what they're thinking. It's just nonsense. Number 8, we talked about the mystery photograph and how we saw the fat pads in that one corner. Robert Kirshner saw them, and by the way, so did Mike Chesser in his recent visits. He also confirmed what I saw and what Kirshner saw. Now, it's somewhat amazing that none of the other observers said that, but they didn't use stereo viewing, so they were at a disadvantage. And then number 10, I mentioned the optical density measurements as being totally consistent with this too. So the list just goes on, and this is not the time or place to bore you with more evidence, but it's in the ebook. I want to show you a few more paradoxes too. These are, I think, central paradoxes in the JFK case. On the left, of course, you see the right lateral X-ray. Circled in red is an area where there's nothing. There's no brain in there, proven by the optical density data. And yet on the right, you see Ida Dox's drawing for the HSCA. The yellow area is all missing in the X-ray. That's how much of a discrepancy we have here. How is that possible? Well, this isn't JFK's brain, so anything's possible. That's the easy answer, and that is the correct answer. You can see again that the cerebellum here is not injured. Now, those yellow particles on the X-ray represent the relative sizes of the metallic debris on the X-ray. I measured these quite meticulously, and they are placed within millimeters of their actual position on the X-ray. This is the fragment that Humes took out, and one of these little ones he also took out. He took out these two. This blue area is also metallic debris. That's the largest deposit, actually. And I drew it in blue because it's very amorphous. It's hard to tell exactly where it stops and starts. It looks like liquid metal. In fact, that's true of most of the metallic debris up there. It looks like the borders are so fuzzy that it could be liquid metal, which means mercury. That's not the case, on the other hand, for this fragment, which was solid metal. Humes took it out. That's not the case for this fragment, which was probably shrapnel that flew up from the street from one of those shots. Question here?
Is that consistent with the mercury around going on?
I think so. If I had to choose the most likely explanation, I think that frontal shot that produced all of this debris was a mercury bullet.
And so the particles would be in the forefront of the brain.
They would be in the anterior portion of the brain, which they are, and the largest particle travels the farthest. There it is. Now, curiously, how many of you have read the novel The Day of the Jackal? A couple of you. The action in The Day of the Jackal occurs in the summer of, guess what year? 1963. And there's a detailed description of preparation of a mercury bullet in that novel. This relates, of course, to the assassination attempts on de Gaulle. That's what the novel's about. Next slide. Here's another paradox for you to think about. You see here is Zapruder frame 312 in the upper corner, but it's also reproduced in the main image. Superimposed over that image is the lateral X-ray, which you just saw. This was put together by David Josephs. Now also you see the tail of the arrow here and the head of the arrow here. That's the Warren Commission arrow, indicating where they thought the trail was from that posterior shot. But you see the trail of metallic fragments is way up here. How could we possibly get a trail like this if the head position is correct? Unless you have a hot air balloon somewhere up here with a gunman firing from a hot air balloon. How did that happen? Well, of course it didn't. This is all nonsense too. Next. Your doctors do that to you? right, so let's think about this one. On your far left is that famous red spot. This, of course, was chosen by the HSCA as the entry site, 4 inches above the site that Humes and Boswell had selected. And Humes and Boswell, too, said, no, that's not the entry site. No, it's not. And did the HSCA listen to them? No. They were wrong. They had to be wrong. They weren't wrong, of course, they were right. Nobody saw that red spot. 16 Dallas doctors were shown this photograph and asked if that's what they remembered. How many of them remembered that? 0. None of them remembered that. They said, that's not what we saw. And no one saw the red spot. But think about this. If that's really the way Kennedy was when he arrived at the morgue, how did this blood get on the back of his shirt? Where'd that come from? Anybody got any ideas? How do you get blood on the back of a shirt, especially on the left side, if there's nothing wrong with the back of your scalp? That's not possible. Something's really wrong here. Well, carry the discussion further. Here is frame Z317. How many of you saw that in Sidney Wilkinson's presentation? You saw frame 317 with the black patch here? Well, the only wound is on the right temple. How does a wound in the right temple cause bleeding back here? Something's wrong here, too. Again, it doesn't make any sense. Question?
When your wife picked up that piece of scalp and came back into could she have possibly put that on there? And what happened to that piece of bone that she picked up?
Well, we don't know if it was a piece of bone. The recollection I have is that she brought some brain tissue into the trauma room 1, not bone. Mm-hmm.
Wasn't that Crenshaw that said that?
Yeah, Charles said that. Mm-hmm. Here are 6 references. Oh, by the way, I wanted to pass those out. I'll collect them in a minute and leave some up here on the table if you want to pick those up. I have printed copies. I want to go back to frame 317 for a minute, since we do have a little time. I think we have a few minutes. We even have some time for questions. We have 10 minutes left, so that's perfect. Sidney didn't tell you the rest of the story, so I'm going to tell you it. You haven't heard this before. In November 2009, Sidney received her 3rd-generation copy of the Zapruder film. That's 9 years ago. No, sorry, it's 2008. It's 10 years ago. And she was, of course, stunned by what she saw, especially with that black patch. And Doug Horn was in the loop here. He saw those images and he put them in his book. Now, while this is going on, at the 6th floor museum here, they have the MPI transparencies. You know what generation those are? They were made directly from the film at NARA. The original is called Generation 0, so MPI has 1st-generation copies. What Sidney got was, anybody remember? 3rd generation. So Sidney showed me what she had as well. So Sidney and I were both going to the meetings here in November, so we said, well, let's go look at those transparencies and see what they have. So we did. In 2009. That's 9 years ago. So Sidney and I are sitting there together with Gary Mack, looking at these transparencies, and we're suddenly we're looking at 317 and we're just blown away. Sidney said when she saw the black patch, the hair on her neck just stood up. And I almost laughed out loud. I remember putting my hand over my mouth because it was such a childish cartoon. even more dramatic than what Sydney showed you. Sydney said it looked like somebody had taken a black ink marker and just sketched it in very clumsily. So we were both very impressed by that. The next year, Sydney comes back to the conference again with Tom, and she decides to show Tom what she saw. Tom's very eager to see what world she's talking about. So they go to the 6th floor again, and they look at the transparencies, and they do not see the black patch. It's not there. Tom says, what are you talking about? There's nothing suspicious here. So Cindy comes home and she calls me up and she says, very anguished, David, I didn't see what you and I saw. Are you sure we saw what we saw? I said, well, this is madness. I have to do this. It took me until 2012 till I got back there and I said, Sydney, doggone it, you're right. This is not what we saw in 2009. Now, when Sydney walks out of the viewing room in 2010, when she was with Tom, who should she run into but Raleigh Zavada, who had just looked at the images too. You all know who Raleigh is. Raleigh is the guru who was hired from Kodak by the ARRB, and Raleigh swears that the Zapruder film is authentic. So she runs into Raleigh Zavada there, of all things. Around the same time, Tink Thompson visits the 6th floor also. And he looks at these images and he says, well, there's nothing there. And so to this day, Tink does not believe the Zapruder film has been altered, and I suppose I wouldn't either if I saw what he saw. But he doesn't know the story that I'm telling you at this moment. Nobody has told him yet, unless somebody sneaked him a preview. So that's the summary of our adventures in the 6th floor museum. Sydney will be coming out with more material, and I think you'll be impressed with it. So I've said my piece. Who else wants to say their piece? Go ahead.
Thanks, Doctor. Could you talk a little bit more about the 6.5 millimeter that was supposedly on the exterior, and also your thoughts on the Belmont memo and this bullet lodged behind the right ear, and what happened to that thing?
Alan Belmont wrote a memo on the night of the 22nd of November saying there was a bullet lodged behind the ear. He doesn't say whether it's left or right, and there's really not a whole lot more in that document. That was found by Joe McBride. So that bullet is obviously not there. James Jenkins and I have had some good discussions this week, and so that also included Mike Chesser. Based on what we know about the brain, we're all three quite convinced that the brain was removed and replaced before the official autopsy began. So why would anyone do this? Well, there's only one reason, isn't it? To remove bullet fragments. So it's conceivable that this Belmont memo is just what is describing of a bullet there was removed. There's no other evidence that we can refer to, though. Now, the 6.5 millimeter object was not removed, was it? It's not in evidence. The only metallic particle in evidence is the one from the forehead area, right up here, that I pointed out. So the 6.5 millimeter object was not removed because it wasn't there. It was not seen by several dozen people the night of the autopsy. And what's really strange is that bright, intelligent, educated folks like Dr. Randy Robertson say that it was there, that everybody just missed it. It sounds like the back of the head story all over again to me. It wasn't there. They couldn't have missed it.
Just real quick, the exterior shot from the rear that had caused the Harper fragment, the metallic, did that bullet exit, and if so, where?
Yes, that's a good question. It's possible that it exited at that site on the triangular fragment that I showed you last night. That's pretty powerful evidence. I think that Angel placed that triangular fragment correctly. We don't know exactly what orientation it should be in because we only have an X-ray. We don't know which surface on that fragment is exterior or interior. So you are at liberty to rotate it and flip it around. But there is metallic debris on there. So it's quite possible that that is the exit site. We just don't know if Angel placed it correctly in the images I showed you.
That the exit site in the rear is, I'm sorry, we think a shot came in from the rear in the back of the head.
Yes.
That it nipped the Harper fragment. If it came from the rear, it must be coming out somewhere up front.
Most likely the posterior shot came in first. The Harper fragment was still in place at that moment. And the Harper fragment was only knocked out with a subsequent shot from the grassy knoll.
Oh, okay, all right.
Probably. Determining the sequence of shots is probably the trickiest part of this, and I have really never gotten very far into that.
Okay,
But,
thank you.
but pretty clearly, you know, in terms of the probability of success with shots, the posterior shot would have been fired first because JFK would have been closer to the shooter early on, and the grassy knoll would have been later because the shooter would have been closer to that site later in the Elm Street sequence.
Okay, thank you very much,
That's
Doctor.
just superficial analysis.
David, I'm Tim Nicholson, by the way, who's did the analysis of
This is Tim Nicholson, by the way, in case some of you don't know. Tim calculated the distance of the Harper fragment from the 313 site on the street as 117 feet. Go ahead.
Yeah. I have three questions. First of all, have you ever spoken to Dr. Ken Salyer?
No,
Or
I
do
have his
you-
book, though. How many
What?
people have his book, by the way? That's what I thought. He does have a book. I found it on sale at a secondhand store. It's worth reading. And
So
of course,
it-
Ken Salyer is also in the Parkland Doctor video, which was shown a year ago in Houston at the mock trial. But go ahead.
Yeah, but I think I heard him at the Lancer conference, I think in 2015, and he was asked at the end of his talk whether the wound in the temple area was an entrance wound, and he said no, and he never offered an explanation. And I'm wondering, you're looking up at the president's head there on the left there, and you see that flap of bone there, and I don't understand how that flap was created. The second question is,
Well, it may have been from that grassy knoll shot in the temple. That's
Okay.
certainly a possibility. It's
okay.
not conclusive.
The second thing is that you and Cheshire, Dr. Cheshire, looked at the X-rays and determined that there was a wound here,
Right,
right above the right eye at the hairline.
at the hairline. yeah.
That can be seen on the lateral X-ray.
On the lateral X-ray, Chester saw what looked like a bullet hole through the forehead bone. Yes, he did see
Okay.
that.
So that is a possible entry point for a bullet.
Well, most likely, and more importantly, because of the metallic debris that is located almost at the same site.
Pardon?
It's an entry wound almost certainly because of the metallic debris that we see at that site.
Okay, so I mean, is it possible that bullet hole is the entry wound for the wound at the back?
No.
It's
You and
not?
I disagree about that.
What?
You and I disagree about that, no. This has to be an entry wound in the right forehead. That's an entry wound.
The one up here,
Yes.
where did the bullet exit from?
Well, as I showed you with metallic debris, it didn't exit. If it was a mercury bullet, it stopped in the head.
Okay, so it's just it's a bullet that didn't exit.
The metallic debris particles are everywhere in the skull. In
Okay.
fact, I didn't emphasize this, but there are lots of tiny metallic debris on the left side of the skull. That's the wrong side.
Yeah.
And that would be consistent with the mercury
Okay.
bullet, too.
The other question, the final question I have, David, is that Agent Clint Hill, when he climbed onto the back of the trunk of the limo to push Jackie back into he claimed that he saw a skull fragment next to JFK with hair all over it. Is anybody
Yes.
familiar with that?
Yes, I think we've all heard that.
And did he ever say how big that piece of bone
I've never
was?
seen a quantitative description of that.
Pardon?
I've never seen a quantitative description.
Any idea where that came from?
No, I don't. But there were other pieces of skull found in Dealey Plaza that day, so that's not surprising.
Mm-hmm.
All the pieces have never been found. I'm going to bring the printed copy of the references and pass them around for you.
Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Dr. David Mantik.